is the legendary Lamborghini Gallardo. And you don't need to hear it from my mouth to know that this car is very special. It was the very first production V10 that Lamborghini ever designed, and it's also the first V10 that we've had on this channel. And second, this car, the Lamborghini Gallardo, literally changed the way that Lambo went about building cars and changed the trajectory of that company forever. I'm Alex, your host, and join me today for Test Drive Lamborghini Gallardo. For this test drive, we have one question. It's pretty well known that by the time this Gallardo arrived on the scene in 2004, Lamborghini actually had been under the ownership umbrella of Volkswagen Audi for over half a decade. And that parent company did have a demand of Lamborghini. They wanted them to move away from the slower built, lower volume flagship vehicles that they produced in a couple hundred per year to something produced a little bit more for the masses, higher volume, lower costs, greater revenue. And what you see in front of you in the Lamborghini Gallardo is the result of that request. So that begs the very simple one question: did Lamborghini cut corners and put together a parts bin Lambo, or did the considerable resources of Audi Volkswagen poured into Lamborghini make for an exceptional supercar even 2 decades later? Let's dive in. So of course, not underneath this frunk, but underneath the vented hood in the rear of this Lambo sits a naturally aspirated 5.0 liter Lamborghini designed V10. Now that V10 is good for 512 horsepower and 376 pound-feet of torque. That's good to get this car 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds. The quarter mile passes by at 12.3 at 118 miles an hour. This Gallardo's top speed is a ridiculous 195 miles an hour, at least with the top up. With the top down, you're restricted to 190. Now you may have heard me say earlier that this is the first production V10 that Lamborghini put out, and that may surprise a few folks. Really, every flagship car from Lamborghini that came prior to this came mostly with a V12, even though there were some V8s produced within Lamborghini's lifetime. The V10 that's featured here on this Lambo is exclusively designed by Lamborghini and used on just one product, and that is the car that you see in front of you. That 5.0 liter naturally aspirated V10 was built from the bottom up from scratch just for this vehicle that ran only from 2004 to 2008. Now, after 2009 model year came out, the Gallardo and the R8 did share a slightly different V10, more Audi derived, and 5.2 liters instead of 5.0. But this 5.0 that we have in this Lambo is one of a kind and used on this car exclusively. Now the Gallardo has a red line sitting just above 8,000 RPM. While torque peaks at around 4,250 RPM, horsepower actually doesn't peak until almost red line. So the Gallardo wants you to push it up to red line every chance you get. Modern fans of the Lamborghini might be a little surprised to know that the Gallardo came available with 2 transmission options. You could either have the automated single clutch manual, better known as E-gear, here in the Lamborghini, or a 6-speed gated manual transmission. Some fun party trivia for you. Before the E-gear, automatics didn't exist at Lamborghini. Matter of fact, if you were going to buy a Lamborghini, you were expected to be able to drive a 3-pedal performance vehicle. When they switched their focus to developing a vehicle that's more For the masses, they correctly assumed that most people don't know how to drive manual. And that's one of the reasons why the E-Gear was so popular on this Gallardo Spider. Matter of fact, 95% of folks that built their Gallardo built it with that automatic E-Gear instead of the gated manual. So for those 5% of you that did choose the manual, no, we appreciate the hell out of you. And you were fighting a good fight that unfortunately we ended up losing at the end. Fast forward to just a decade after the Gallardo debuted, and automated transmissions are your only option. If you're looking to buy a modern Lambo in these days, disappointingly, you're not even going to find a manual transmission offered. So unfortunately, the popularity of that E-Gear transmission on this Gallardo started to spell the end of manual transmissions across Lamborghini in entirety. So this Lambo lived in a generation before adaptive dampers really came into vogue. So all you have on this is one available suspension option, and that's a fully independent double wishbone all aluminum 4-corner suspension that actually handles the Gallardo's weight really well. Because it is an old school exotic suspension, I will say that it communicates everything that you encounter in the road, whether it's a small imperfection or even the tiniest of pebbles. You feel that communicated through the steering wheel.
So, I've got to say that while it's a pretty rough ride, it's very competent. Body roll isn't a thing in the super wide Gallardo, and you learn to trust it very quickly. Even 20 years later, the suspension holds up really well.
To go hand in hand with the great suspension, you have meaty tires. 19s all around, 235s up front, a little thin, but in the rear, you have massive 295s, and that definitely goes hand in hand with a great handling experience. Weighing in at 3,660 pounds, the Gallardo Spider is no featherweight. Matter of fact, that's 120 pounds more than it weighs for its coupe counterpart. And as you would expect with an engine sitting behind the driver, the weight distribution isn't exactly 50-50. Matter of fact, it's 42% of the weight on the front axle and 58% in the rear. Add in the fact that while this is all-wheel drive, the tuning doesn't have a 50-50 split. 30% of torque goes to the front wheels, with 70% going to the rear. So what that means is a rear-biased all-wheel drive coupled with a car that weighs more in the rear. Well, if you want to put the back end out on this Gallardo, it's very easy to do that. You might have started to notice a trend as we've been discussing the Gallardo. It's the fact that this is a very old school feeling exotic, and the braking options do that as well. So no carbon ceramic brake option, you just have steel rotors all around, 14.4 inches up front, 13 inches in the rear, very capable of slowing down this vehicle from any speed. But I will say one thing, the feel is missing a little bit. It's a little stiff. Instead of there being more of a progression through the brake pedal slowing you down, it really feels like it's a little bit more all or nothing. Like when you're hitting the brake pedal, you're pressing down on a rock and you just have to trust that you're pressing it hard enough. So not much give, not much feel, but very capable braking performance on this Gallardo. Now, if you haven't heard the story and history behind the founding of Lamborghini Car Company, it's a fascinating one. And yes, of course, it does bring in Enzo Ferrari as the main antagonist to our main character that started Lamborghini. And here's that story.
Lamborghini has been around in some form since 1948. Ferrucio Lamborghini, the founder, was born into a family of Italian grape farmers. Being a World War II mechanic, after the war, he started building tractors using surplus military parts. Ferrucio owned several Ferraris, but thought they were too noisy, too uncomfortable, and too temperamental mechanically. Reportedly, he complained about the clutch on his Ferrari to Enzo Ferrari himself, who said something along the lines of, "It's not the car, it's the driver. Go back to driving tractors." So Ferrucio's response? I can build my own. Thus, in 1963, Lamborghini Car Company was born with a big philosophical difference. Ferrucio famously said he hated racing, while Enzo loved it. So Lamborghini aimed to build more luxury grand touring cars. While Ferrucio hated racing, his engineers secretly worked on a mid-engine sports prototype, which eventually became the Lamborghini Miura, what many people consider to be the very first supercar.
Now, a lot of vehicles that were featured on the test drive series have had some sort of active exhaust, so that when you're in your neighborhood or you're doing a cold start early in the morning, you can kind of keep that muffled. When it comes to the Gallardo, absolutely no active exhaust exists. It's full Lamborghini experience from start to finish, no matter how or when you're driving it. All that exists on this are very thin steel pipes going from that V10, allowing the shriek out the back of the vehicle. And it really is more of a shriek than a roar. This car sounds phenomenal as you're pushing it up that tachometer to the 8,000 plus RPM red line, in my opinion. What are your thoughts on the Gallardo's exhaust notes? Leave it in the comments below. Let's talk interior design for a moment on the Lamborghini, because there's an old adage that says that Lamborghini used to build the cars first and then figure out if humans could fit inside. And I think that saying still relates very well for the Lambo that we have on our hands. Now, from a looks perspective, it's undeniably gorgeous. The seats in black leather with yellow trim look fantastic. Face it, if red is Ferrari's color, yellow is Lamborghini's, and it looks great across the vehicle. Now, some of the other styling is pretty straightforward. You have a very simplistic steering wheel here, nothing on it like the controls that we see on the Mercedes or the Range Rover SVR that we just featured on this channel. Just a very straightforward layout. This car even has heated seats, but that is where the comfort ends and the quirkiness of Lamborghini really starts to pick up. If you look right here in the center console, well, these are your controls for literally everything across the vehicle, whether it's your windows, headlights, traction control, all of your heated seats, climate control, infotainment are going to be right here. And put your head down a little bit more to the center console, and that's where you start to see some unusual buttons. This one right here in the middle, well, that's actually for the side mirrors of all things. And then you find 3 buttons right underneath that. Sport, self-explanatory for the most part. It just turns the automatic transmission into a little bit more of one that will hold the tachometer up and not quite upshift as early. This A button actually switches it from its manual paddle mode into automatic, but this third button here is where you would expect to find an R to put this car in reverse, because you can't do it via these fairly simplistic paddle shifters. No. If you're looking to put this car in reverse, you actually have to go all the way across the steering column, and you'll find a lonesome button with the letter R on it, where a lot of other cars would have their headlight control. To put this car in reverse, you have to find that button and hit it. A lot of places where folks wouldn't necessarily look. So that starts some of the Lamborghini quirkiness. Now, I would say while they're very good looking, these bucket seats aren't meant for long road trips. They're not going to coddle you. This is very much an old school exotic, and you get that feeling when you're driving it for hours on end. Matter of fact, if you go down to where the pedals are, there's a uniquely Lamborghini setup there too. You really don't have a place to put your left leg. It's a very thin compartment that really makes it to where you have to work to fit your feet in. So very quirky, very Lamborghini all the way around, and while it is a gorgeous interior, is not necessarily something that you'd want to stay in for hours on end.
The frunk in this Gallardo is usable, but just hardly. It does come with some sweet Lambo embroidered bags though.
Let's talk styling for a moment, because you know exactly what's coming down the road when you see that very square front end of the Gallardo rolling down. I think Lamborghini did a fantastic job with making a true exotic vehicle, even if it was lower in price than some of those flagship cars that came before it, like the Diablo.
The Gallardo has a bit of a baby Diablo or Murcielago look to it, which isn't a surprise since they all shared the same head of design, Luke Donkelwolk. A lot of performance cars from this era shied away from bold looks, opting instead for smooth, swept-back styling, elegant curves, flowing lines, cars that felt more like sculpted works of automotive art. The Gallardo didn't do that. It's more weapon than sculpture. Sharp curves, hard angles, aggressive styling. It wasn't designed for elegance, it was designed to intimidate. And that 2000 styling ended up timeless, still looking spectacular today. The top was surprisingly pleasant and efficient for a car so raw and from so long ago. It's fascinating watching the entire vented rear end of the Spider come up to make room for the top. Also, it's during this process that affords your only real chance to see the engine, as the piece that the soft top sits on unfortunately covers the visual best of the engine in this Spider. A surprising feature for a car of the early 2000s is the Lambo's bumper saving feature. Becoming more common on many high-end cars just relatively recently, the early 2000s Gallardo could lift its bumper using hydraulics for low clearance situations. You know, a long time back, Doug did a video, "Does driving a Ferrari attract women?" This isn't a Ferrari, so I don't know if it gets you the attention you're seeking, but anecdotally, the Lambo did seem to turn heads.
Let's talk about the Gallardo's place in history as it impacted Lamborghini, because honestly, outside of the first vehicle that ever debuted from Lamborghini cars, the Gallardo probably has a more profound impact than any other vehicle. And this is why. See, prior to the Gallardo, Lamborghini focused on low volume, high cost, high hands-on production vehicles. Now, some of those models tended to run a little long, up to 15 years at a time. But as it turns out, it's hard for a company to survive building 300 to 400 cars per year. And Lamborghini learned that the hard way when they went bankrupt in 1978. Now, a struggle since that bankruptcy started to get a little brighter when Lamborghini was acquired and fell under the ownership umbrella of Volkswagen Audi in 1999. But that parent company did have some demands. They wanted Lamborghini to shift away from that lower volume approach to a car more for the masses, something that could be scaled and used in a higher volume capacity. And that's where this baby Lambo enters the picture. So Audi helped modernize some of the processes, but still let Lamborghini fully design this Gallardo that we have in front of us. And the result? Astounding success. The volume on this Gallardo that ran from 2004 to 2014 was a total of 14,022 vehicles. Now, for an apples to apples comparison on just how successful this vehicle was, before the Gallardo, this best-selling vehicle in Lamborghini's entire lineup was the Diablo with 2,900 total produced. With over 14,000 produced of the Gallardo, you see that this was an exponentially higher success. Now, how did that end up affecting Lamborghini? Well, when you have that stable revenue coming in from a higher volume amount of cars, it allowed the capital to be a little bit more experimental with some of the vehicles that they ended up producing after the Gallardo. So the modern Lamborghini that we see today as a company is completely due to the success of the Gallardo and the stabilized revenue that that brought to the company. Let's talk competition. At its soul, Lamborghini was designed as a company to compete with Ferrari, even though they wanted to do things a little differently. So, one of the natural competitors is the Ferrari F430. You also can toss in the Porsche 911 Turbo S.
Performance between the three are all within the same ballpark. The Porsche is a little more swift and nimble. The Italians, more about raw power, styling, and soundtrack. All three with absurdly high top speeds just under 200 miles an hour. One car I would not compare the Gallardo to is the Audi R8, at least in the first gen. Check out the R8 test drive video for exactly why they don't compete well, but it basically boils down to the fact that the R8 uses an Audi-derived V8, while of course this Gallardo had its own V10. Again, at least when each car initially debuted.
So, what are some of the positives behind the first generation of Lamborghini Gallardo? Our first positive isn't going to surprise anybody that's watched these videos before. It goes 1000% to that V10 that sits just behind the driver. That 5.0 naturally aspirated V10 is something that we literally don't have anymore. So many cars are boosted nowadays, generally turbocharged, and it doesn't give you that raw, unfiltered, linear experience that this V10 does deliver. The V10 is exotic, brutal, raw, and it's such a short trip from that massive V10 sitting right behind the driver for the exhaust to go through those thin steel walls out the dual exhaust in the back. And as you can hear, it's a phenomenal soundtrack and a very exotic V10 that I just don't think you're ever going to find out there again. Our next positive for the Gallardo, well, it's the chaotic rear-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive system. I'm not going to cut corners with you all. I think that this is probably the most driftable car that we've had on this channel. And let me explain why. It's a combination of its weight, its all-wheel drive setup, and how that V10 delivers power. First, when you turn traction control off and put this car into a drift, the V10 has the perfect power delivery to deliver a predictable amount of torque so that you have confidence during that drift. Now, the rear-wheel drive weighting of that mid-engine design, having 58% of the weight on that back axle, makes it very driftable. But when you still have 30% of torque going to these front two wheels, it creates a little bit of a save. It more glides you through your drift rather than snaps back like something you would see maybe on the E92 M3. No, I think out of every car that we've featured on this test drive channel, this thing is a drift factory, and that definitely caught me by surprise. Our next positive? Well, it's the fact that this Gallardo is an old school exotic in what's relatively a new wrapper, even if it is a couple decades old. Think about how this car is set up. Everything is old school, whether it's the analog gauges, the hydraulic steering, the fact there are no adaptive dampers, no drive modes, no active exhaust. This was the start of the transfer of that generation of old school exotic to the more modern hyper technology exotics that we had. This was the first car to debut with an option of either a manual transmission or that 6-speed e-gear. Now, obviously not enough people bought this in 6-speed gated manual because the manual transmission disappeared from Lamborghini entirely less than a decade after this car debuted. Nevertheless, you truly have a car that has a really old school feel. On the opposite side, what are some of the negatives behind this generation of Lamborghini Gallardo? Our first negative is something that you've heard me complain about in other test drives before, and it is just how bad the blind spots are in the B pillar on these mid-engine cars. Now, this is something that if you watch the other test drive series, you've seen me complain about, whether it was the C8 Corvette, the Audi R8, or any of those other mid-engine cars. They all naturally have a little bit of a disadvantage with blind spots in their B pillars. But here's the thing, this Gallardo is by far the worst. When it has the top up, you literally have no clue what's going on either the driver or passenger side in that blind spot. And unlike the C8 Corvette, which had some technology to let you know what's hovering in that spot, this Gallardo, of course, doesn't have that. And with the extra small mirrors, it's hard to get them within your field of vision. Now, even with the top down, of course, you can see out a little bit better, especially the driver's side. But I will say that you sit so low in the Gallardo that the passenger side is hard to see out over that hump where the V10 sits. This is by far the most egregious blind spot car that we've ever driven. And if you're navigating through heavy traffic, you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of confidence, because sometimes you're just taking guesses whether or not that spot's open based on what you see passing you and behind you. Our next negative, well, it's the absurdly on-point Lamborghini DNA that made its way into the interior design quirks of this Gallardo. And I'm not talking about the fact that this lacks cup holders, which is true, or the fact that it only has a 4-speaker sound system, which is also true, but the actual design layout of the interior and maybe the lack of intuitive thinking with that design. We talked about how Lamborghini's old adage is they would build the car first and then figure if humans would fit, and that is still an adage that applies to this Gallardo here. Whether it is the unique design of everything right there in the center console, or the absurd nature of having reverse and a completely separate part of the vehicle, or just some of the quirks that go on inside this car, it is purely Lamborghini when it comes to that design, largely before Audi really brought in refinement and maybe even making more sense of what's going on in this vehicle. Our last negative is a bit of a quirky one, and it's just how bad the turning radius feels on this Gallardo. Not to break kayfabe too much, but every time you see me in a video doing this, means that I'm also doing this. So yes, I've done a lot of U-turns in the cars on our test drive series, and the Gallardo by far feels the worst out of all of the test drive cars that we have for turning radius. And here's why. The front wheels really don't allow for a lot of turn-in or articulation, and the fact that this vehicle is fairly long contributes to the fact that it doesn't really turn on a dime when you're trying to pull a U-turn. The irony is, you're much better off if you look at one of our positives, giving this thing a little bit of gas when you need to pull a U-turn at a light or anything like that. Now, time to answer the question that we started with. Put simply, because the Gallardo is a direct order from Volkswagen Audi after they acquired Lamborghini to produce a higher volume vehicle. Did Lamborghini cut corners when designing the Gallardo, or did Audi's resources just improve this vehicle feel? My answer? Oh, it's absolutely the latter. This Gallardo is an Italian exotic through and through, from front to back.
While yes, the Gallardo was Lamborghini's inflection point from low-volume cars to higher output, you shouldn't view the Gallardo as a half-ass effort or parts-bin Lambo in any way. Borrowed looks? Sure. Shared all-aluminum frame with the R8? Yes, but you got a one-of-a-kind Lamborghini design V10 combined with arguably the most widely usable Lambo in existence up to that point with E-Gear. There's a reason the Gallardo has held such great value after all this time, despite being the most entry-level Lamborghini produced ever.
It has that raw, visceral feel, and I promise you, if you ever have a chance to get behind the wheel of a Gallardo, your smile is going to light up, just like that V10 does the minute that you turn the key in the ignition. No, this is truly a relic of the past, a perfect masterpiece of what cars used to be like. No turbocharging or supercharging, just a super linear V10 that screams and wails through very thin steel pipes. And honestly, I think the Gallardo delivers the exact experience that we're trying to chase and we created this channel for. Trying to get our hands on cars that are old school, that make you feel. So what do you think? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? What are your thoughts behind the first generation of the Lamborghini Gallardo? Do you think maybe it is a little bit too old school exotic feel? There's not enough modern features to it? Or are you maybe like me and probably grew up having a poster of one of these on your wall, idolizing the Lamborghini Gallardo? I most certainly fall under that category. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Test Drive Lamborghini Gallardo. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean the world to me if you hit like. And if you want to join us for more test drive adventures and support this channel, please consider hitting subscribe, because our whole goal on this channel is to get our hands on cars like the old school Lamborghini Gallardo, cars that make you feel. And I promise you, as we've talked about, this visceral, raw V10 that sits just behind the driver in the Gallardo absolutely makes you feel. As always, if you made it to the end of the video, just know that we appreciate the hell out of you. I'm Alex, your host from Third Pedal Performance, and I'll see you on the next test drive.